Under a crescent moon barely piercing the black Afghan sky, the low rumble of distant artillery murmured like a growl from the earth itself, and Sergeant Clay Harper, age 61, pressed his back against the rust-streaked concrete foundation of an abandoned outpost that now served as the enemy's communications hub deep within the Kunar province. The air was thick with the stench of motor oil, acrid smoke from nearby fires, and the sour odor of unwashed uniforms, each scent weaving into the memory of wars he thought he'd left behind decades ago. Once a respected field technician during the Gulf War, Clay had returned to the battlefield not as a fighter, but as a civilian advisor, attached to a small recon unit to evaluate enemy infrastructure for demolition strategies. Many of the younger soldiers he was paired with barely acknowledged him beyond calling him Pops, dismissing him as a relic, a walking museum piece who still believed in paper maps and soldering irons instead of satellites and drone strikes. But when their insertion went sideways, ambushed by insurgent fighters just miles from their intended objective, it was Clay who had spotted the hidden crawlspace behind a collapsed storage shed, and it was Clay who had shoved the stunned survivors into it while bullets sparked against rusted barrels and dust rained from the ceiling. They hadn't fired a shot in return. Not a single one. Because Clay knew they weren't here to fight. They were here to listen, to observe, and to survive long enough to pass the knowledge back to command. Now, packed into the narrow confines of an air shaft barely wider than his shoulders, Clay could hear every intake and exhale of breath from the three others beside him. Corporal Banks, a skeptical 22-year-old tech specialist with a smart mouth and a busted arm. Private Lujan, 19, barely old enough to shave, whose eyes still hadn't stopped darting since the ambush, and Lieutenant Erica Rowe, their mission lead, trying to keep her breathing calm despite the cracked rib that made every movement a grunt of pain. The shaft they hid in snaked above a cluster of hallways within the enemy base, rusted grates and bolts occasionally groaning beneath them as they shifted slightly to ease cramped muscles or wipe sweat from their brows. Outside, in the hallways below, boots thudded, enemy soldiers moving in squads, their voices echoing through the concrete corridors in a guttural dialect Clay didn't fully understand, but had learned enough of in the 90s to catch fragments. "Commander, satellite, move the gear before sunrise." Those words, floating up through the air vents, landed heavily on Clay's ears as he lay flat on his stomach, cheek pressed against the warm metal of the shaft. He was closest to the main vertical duct, where a corroded mesh panel separated him from the open space below, allowing sound to travel like whispers through a cathedral. The others had gone quiet, listening too, but it was Clay who recognized the rhythm and urgency in the voices below. Not just routine chatter, but something bigger. He craned his neck, ignoring the stiff protest of his joints, and spotted through the grid the top of a tactical map laid out on a folding table beneath them. Two men stood beside it, one pointing at positions with a stylus, the other nodding solemnly while speaking into a radio. Clay's breath caught as he recognized the map. It was a satellite-printed terrain layout of Firebase Hammer, one of the last strongholds held by U.S. and coalition forces in the region, and the location of a massive underground munitions stockpile. The base hadn't seen heavy conflict in weeks, which made it a prime candidate for the kind of ambush Clay was now hearing plotted. "They'll hit Hammer at dawn," he muttered, voice barely audible. "They're shifting artillery and drone uplinks. And they've already got someone on the inside." Lieutenant Rowe shifted painfully to face him. "You sure?" she whispered. Clay nodded grimly. "Positive. I caught a name. American." There was a beat of silence as the implication landed like a thunderclap. A traitor. A mole. And unless someone stopped this, Firebase Hammer would be reduced to rubble before sunrise. Banks muttered a quiet curse, trying to reposition with his sling-bound arm. "We can't move." "We're boxed in," Rose said, her voice tight with pain. "Even if we break out, we're too far from the relay post to transmit." Clay didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled his battered canvas satchel closer, unzipping it to retrieve an old, compact field transmitter, his own, brought from retirement, dismissed by techs as a museum piece, but stubbornly reliable even in electromagnetic interference. He had modified it for low-power burst transmission, and he had one shot at sending a data ping to a repeater drone currently circling 30 clicks north. He calibrated the frequency, fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. "I'll crawl back to the intake hatch. From there, I can get a cleaner line of sight to the relay drone. If I bounce the coordinates and a warning ping, they'll have enough to scramble reinforcements or at least prepare the base." Rowe shook her head. "You won't make it. The patrols are thick on that side. You'll be seen." Clay gave a thin smile, half tired, half resigned. I'm not exactly invisible, I know that. But they're not looking for me. They're looking for a threat, a fighter, a kid with a rifle. Not some grizzled old gearhead crawling through ducts. I've spent my life slipping through cracks, fixing what people thought was broken beyond repair. This time, I just need to fix a war. He started moving before she could argue, belly sliding inch by inch through the stifling darkness, the metal creaking beneath his weight like the hull of a sinking ship. Every movement sent echoes through the ducts, each one a nail-biting risk. Below, voices murmured, boots passed, radios crackled. Clay could feel sweat dripping into his ears, his breath coming shallow from the dust and heat. At one point, he froze as a patrol passed directly underneath. 3 figures, rifles slung, one of them laughing at a joke Clay couldn't understand. He didn't breathe until their footsteps faded, then resumed inching forward. The intake hatch came into view, a rusted slat of metal backed by mesh, behind which a sliver of open desert flickered in the moonlight. He maneuvered into position, flipping open the transmitter, lining up the signal. It would take 20 seconds. An eternity. Static hissed in his earpiece. Then, a crackling connection. He punched in the coordinates, his thumbs clumsy but certain, and pressed transmit. A soft click. A pulse sent. Confirmation blinked green. He allowed himself a breath. Just one. Then the duct behind him groaned, a loose bolt shifting, and he saw a flashlight beam sweep the corridor outside. Clay froze, heart pounding, waiting to see if they had noticed. The beam passed once, then again, then moved on. He slumped against the metal, eyes closed. He had done it. Now, they just had to survive until the reinforcements arrived, or until they could find another way out. Behind him, in the shadows of the vent, the others waited, injured, exhausted, but alive. The plan wasn't over. But for the first time since the ambush, hope stirred in the stale, metallic air. And in that cramped duct filled with sweat and silence, the oldest man on the mission had just fired the first shot in a battle no one had expected him to fight. Clay Harper didn't move for nearly 5 minutes after the enemy patrol passed below the ventilation intake, every inch of his body straining to stay silent while sweat trickled down the side of his neck and pooled at his collar. His ears tuned to the slightest vibration in the sheet metal around him. The green light on his transmitter still blinked in the corner of his vision, a silent sentinel marking the success of his message. Coordinates, threat details, and a scrambled warning about the impending attack on Firebase Hammer sent to the only drones still in the area. If the relay caught it and if command acted fast enough, there was a chance they could reinforce the base or at least evacuate the stockpile. But Clay knew better than to believe hope alone would carry them through. The enemy base they were holed up in wasn't just a forward post, it was the nerve center of the offensive, and judging by the voices below, the enemy wasn't slowing down. From his spot near the intake, he could hear the muffled clatter of boots and equipment, more frequent now, and the barked orders of a man he recognized by voice, the one directing the strike in the map room. Clay made the slow crawl back toward the others, his knees and elbows grinding against rivets and rust flakes, each movement a silent war of willpower over pain, and when he reached the main shaft where Rowe, Banks, and Lujan were huddled in the dark, his breath was ragged. "It's sent," he whispered, his voice rasping from the dust. "We've got a chance, but we're not waiting for rescue here. They're ramping up. We need to move before they lock this place down." Rowe gave him a look, half relief, half apprehension, and nodded, her face pale beneath grime and blood. "Any idea how?" Clay tapped the metal beneath him. "These vents run all the way to the east side of the compound. That's where they bring in supply trucks. If we make it to the offloading bays, we might be able to slip out with the next convoy, assuming they don't check every crate." Banks grunted, shifting his injured arm. "And if they do? Then we're dead in a box," Clay said without humor. "But it's better than waiting for them to find us here." Lujan swallowed hard but nodded. He hadn't said much since the ambush, but the resolve in his eyes now was something Clay had seen before in young soldiers facing fear they didn't know they could survive. Clay took point again, leading them belly first through the ductwork, past junctions that groaned with age and spots where the air grew so hot it felt like crawling through an oven. Once, they had to stop for nearly 20 minutes as another squad passed below, arguing about a missing radio case while Clay held his breath and prayed no one looked up. The deeper they crawled, the more Clay's body protested. His knees screamed, his shoulders ached, and his fingers, scarred from years of solder burns and old Gulf sand, began to cramp. But he kept moving, because turning back wasn't an option, and because the look on Rose's face when he told her the message had gone through was enough to keep him going another yard, and then another. Eventually, the shaft widened slightly, splitting into a T-junction where a vertical duct led down toward what Clay guessed was the warehouse. Through a thin grate, he could see flashes of movement: men loading crates, forklifts whining, someone shouting in clipped bursts. The convoy hadn't left yet. They still had time. He turned to Banks and Lujan. "We're going down there. Wait until my signal, then follow. Quiet as ghosts." Rose shook her head. "I'll go first. You're worn down." Clay gave her a tight smile. "I've crawled through tanks narrower than this in triple-digit heat, Lieutenant. I'm fine." And before she could argue further, he unscrewed the vent cover slowly, each turn a muffled prayer the rust wouldn't shriek, then slipped down into the shadows behind a stack of wooden pallets, vanishing from their sight. The warehouse was loud, chaotic, and bathed in flickering fluorescent light that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. Clay moved low and fast, ducking behind a crate marked with unfamiliar Cyrillic letters, his ears ringing with the echo of a soldier barking orders near the loading bay. The truck was there, an old canvas-covered vehicle that reminded him of a deuce and a half from decades ago, engine idling, ready to move. He counted 5 guards, 2 near the truck, 3 others pacing the floor with rifles slung but unsnapped. Too many to fight, too risky to bluff. But maybe. He crept closer to the far wall, found a stack of crates marked with red triangles, explosives or fuel he guessed, and dug into his satchel. The EMP charge he'd modified was meant for electronics, not people, but if he could fry the lighting and cause a panic, they might have a chance. He set the charge, timed it for a 30-second delay, then slipped back toward the vent, signaling upward. Lujan dropped first, light and quiet. Banks followed, teeth clenched against pain. Rose came last, biting down a groan as her ribs protested. "What now?" Banks whispered. Clay pointed toward the truck. "When the lights go, we run. Get in the crates. You 3 in the big one marked for Kabul. I'll follow in the next. We've got 1 shot." Then the lights flickered and died. The EMP burst with a metallic crack, plunging the warehouse into confusion. Shouts erupted, guards scrambling, forklifts grinding to a halt. In the chaos, Clay grabbed the edge of a pallet, shoved the lid aside, and helped Rose climb in, then Banks, then Lujan. He slammed the crate shut, grabbed the one beside it, popped the top, and crawled in himself just as a beam of flashlight swept past. Heart hammering, he heard the sound of crates being loaded, the rough slam of doors, and the growl of the truck's engine as it rolled out into the night. Inside the dark box, packed between rations and tarps, Clay tried not to breathe too loudly. The air stank of rubber and diesel. Time slowed to a crawl. Every bump of the road jarred his spine, every sudden turn made his gut lurch. He didn't know how long they drove, an hour, maybe more, but eventually the truck halted. Voices outside. The hiss of air brakes. Crates being offloaded. And then, silence. Clay waited, counting heartbeats. When it seemed clear, he cracked the lid, peered out. The truck was in a small depot near the outer perimeter of the base, half a mile from where they'd been. No guards in sight. He climbed out, scanned for the others. Rose's crate was being lifted by a loader. He dashed forward, startling the operator, a young insurgent who barely had time to react before Clay struck him with the butt of his pistol. The man crumpled. Clay helped Rose out. She was pale, gasping, but mobile. Banks and Lujan followed. "Where to now?" Lujan asked. Clay looked up at the night sky. The drone would have relayed his signal by now. That meant 2 things. Reinforcements could be en route, and the enemy might be pulling back or preparing for a confrontation. They had to link up with friendlies, or at least send confirmation of their position. Clay led them to an old maintenance shack, kicked open the rusted door, and powered up a disused transmitter, old tech, but similar to his own. He tuned to the emergency band. "Hammer Base, this is Ghostfire 4, priority message, authenticate Echo 9er 9er. We are alive. Coordinates pinged. Confirm assault intel. Silence. Then, crackle. Ghostfire 4. Hammer base copy. Drone confirmed burst. Reinforcements inbound. Sit tight. Good work. Clay slumped against the wall, breathing hard. The morning light crawled reluctantly over the jagged horizon, turning the Afghan hills into smudged silhouettes beneath a rising haze of dust and smoke as Clay Harper crouched behind the crumbling wall of the maintenance shack. His hands blackened with engine grease and dried blood, eyes locked on the perimeter of the enemy base that, just hours ago, he and his small group had infiltrated and narrowly escaped from. Beside him, Lieutenant Erica Rowe leaned against a rusted toolbox, one hand clutching her side where the cracked ribs still screamed with every breath, while Banks sat cross-legged nearby, face pale but focused as he rewired the backup comm panel inside the shack, and Luhan kept lookout through a shattered window, his trembling hands gripping a pair of battered binoculars. The morning air carried the distant pop of small arms fire, likely from scouts engaging somewhere north of the base, and Clay knew time was running short. They hadn't just stumbled into enemy territory. They had walked straight into the epicenter of an operation that was hours away from launching a catastrophic assault, and despite his successful transmission of the intercepted intel, reinforcements were still miles away, delayed by weather and skirmishes along the route. Worse, the enemy now knew something had gone wrong. The patrols had increased. A drone had circled low over the depot minutes earlier. The air buzzed with tension. The entire base was winding up like a spring before a hammer strike. Clay stood, dusting off his knees, the old pain in his joints flaring again, but he ignored it as he turned to the others. "We can't wait," he said firmly. "They'll either find us, or they'll launch the assault before our people get here. We need to break that operation from inside. Stop it cold." Rowe gave him a skeptical look. "There's 4 of us and an old shack full of busted parts. What do you suggest? We knock on their front gate." Clay walked over to the corner where a rusted power generator sat dormant, half covered in a tattered tarp, and pulled it aside to reveal a stockpile of neglected equipment. Some of it ancient, some barely usable, but to Clay it was gold. Coils of copper wire, an old gas-powered welder, a cracked battery bank, and, most importantly, a field-frequency amplifier, Russian-made, but intact. He gave a half-smile. "We're not going through the gate. We're going under it." He outlined the plan quickly, the words tumbling from him with urgency but clarity, honed by years of technical thinking. The old service tunnels beneath the compound, partially collapsed but still partially functional, could be accessed from a sealed maintenance hatch about 200 yards from their position. Clay had spotted it during his time in the ventilation ducts and memorized the layout. If they could get inside, navigate the narrow, flooded tunnels, and reach the central relay room, located beneath the map chamber where the attack was being coordinated, they could plant a timed signal overload using the amplifier and a modified power surge, frying the internal comms and servers long enough to delay the operation and cause enough confusion for their reinforcements to arrive and punch through. "And how do we survive the overload?" Banks asked, eyebrows raised. "We won't be close when it blows," Clay assured him. "It'll run on a timed loop, triggered by the base's own generators. We just need to sneak in, wire it up, and sneak back out." Rowe sighed, nodding slowly. "It's insane. But it might just work." Within an hour, they were on the move again, low and fast across the rubble-strewn ground, ducking between debris piles and defunct vehicles, the heat already beginning to rise off the sand like a living thing. At one point, they had to dive into a dry ditch as a patrol truck rolled by, the tires crunching inches from Clay's boots, a soldier's cigarette smoke trailing behind him like a ghost. They reached the hatch without being spotted. It was rusted shut, the handle jammed from decades of neglect, but Clay knelt beside it, cracked his knuckles, and went to work. With Banks watching his 6 and Luhan keeping lookout, he pried open the panel, bypassed the corroded lock mechanism with a piece of wire and sheer muscle memory, and eased the door open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo louder than gunfire in the stillness. The tunnels inside smelled like rot and oil, the air thick with mildew and the distant drip of condensation. The walls were lined with peeling insulation and rusted conduit, barely lit by the occasional emergency bulb still sputtering weak light after all these years. They moved in silence, flashlights low, weapons at the ready. Clay took the lead, navigating by instinct and old blueprints etched into his mind. He had worked on military bases like this years ago, helped build the power systems they now crept beneath, and though every corner brought new danger, he felt strangely at home down here in the dark. It wasn't long before they reached the substation chamber directly below the central relay room. Clay motioned for them to stop, crouched near the main conduit box, and began setting up the amplifier, his fingers flying over wires and circuits, stripping, fusing, and soldering with a speed and precision that belied his age. Banks handed him tools as needed, Luhan held the flashlight, and Ro kept her pistol trained on the stairwell. "Once I connect this final relay," Clay whispered, "we'll have 20 minutes before it overloads their system. We'll use that time to get out the same way we came and radio our guys to move in." He paused, staring at the wires. Something in him hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of memory. Years ago, in another war, he had done something similar to save his unit from an ambush. He remembered the sound of the overload, the glow in the air, and the silence that followed. That mission had left 2 of his best friends dead. This one couldn't end the same way. He looked up at Ro. "If something goes wrong, you get out. Don't come back for me." "Like hell," she said quietly. He nodded anyway and flipped the final switch. The amplifier began to hum. They turned and moved. But something had changed in the tunnel. A sound, faint, then louder, footsteps, echoing down the corridor they'd come through. Clay froze, signaling the others to duck behind a row of rusted pipes. 2 enemy soldiers appeared, flashlights sweeping. One muttered something in a low voice. Another laughed. They were searching. If they saw the setup, they'd dismantle it. Without thinking, Clay stood, stepped into the open, and fired once. Clean, sharp. The lead soldier dropped. The second spun, startled, and Ro finished him with a precise shot. But the noise had echoed. "Move!" Clay barked, grabbing the pack with the transmitter gear and hauling it over his shoulder. They ran through the tunnels as alarms began to wail above. Lights flickered red. The entire base was alert now. Clay led them through a side access door, up a crumbling stairwell, and out into the far western side of the compound, smoke beginning to rise from one of the towers as the overload initiated its final sequence. They sprinted across the field, bullets suddenly kicking up dirt behind them, snipers firing from rooftops, and Luhan screamed as a round clipped his shoulder, sending him tumbling into the dust. Clay doubled back, hoisted the boy to his feet, and half carried him toward the outer trench line where a broken section of perimeter wall lay collapsed.